Interfaith Partnership Against Domestic Violence, and welcome to Safe Havens' Supporting Victims and Survivors of Faith webinar series. We've been getting terrific feedback, and we hope you are finding these webinars helpful. This is number 4 in the series. We've already had webinars on why faith is important, on supporting Jewish victims and survivors, and on supporting Muslim victims and survivors. Still to come are webinars on supporting African American Christian victims, which will be on May 11th, victims of clergy abuse on May 30th, Latina victims on June 1st, and victims of elder abuse on June 13th. And we'll review all these upcoming dates again at the end of this presentation. If you're not able to join us for any of these webinars or for all of them, or if you've missed a few, don't worry. They are being recorded and posted to the Safe Havens website. We know that not all victims of faith are faith affiliated, but for those who are, faith can be a significant factor in how they make decisions and see options and understand what is happening, and also how they heal. So many advocates are interested in learning more about how faith affects victims of abuse because this information can help them meet the needs of their clients. We also know that many advocates are faith affiliated and many are not. We're not here to suggest that advocates be faith affiliated or even become faith experts at all. However, we have been asked many times for basic information that will help advocates serve faith-affiliated clients. And we put this webinar series together with that in mind. Knowing more about various faith communities can help advocates reach out to and build bridges with local faith communities as well. Safe Havens has many resources on our website that can help you with outreach, and we also provide training and technical assistance to support your outreach and partnership building efforts. So please contact us if you're interested in learning more about any of that. We're going to stop about halfway through today and ask for questions, and then we'll stop again at the end for questions. So feel free to just type your questions into the chat box, and we're looking forward to those. So today's webinar is going to focus on Christian victims and their experience with intimate partner violence. Over the years, many Christian victims have turned to Safe Havens for help. They've told us their stories and the stories of their family members and friends and neighbors, and generously shared with us how their faith has intersected with their experiences of abuse. So it's in their honor and with deep gratitude to them all that we present this webinar to you today. We're really, really glad that you've joined us. The webinar series is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women at the U.S. Department of Justice, and we're thankful for their continued support of this crucially important work. And we especially want to thank our grant manager, Charlotte Turpin. With me today are my Safe Havens colleagues, Allison Morse-Katzman and Shireen Akram-Bouchard. Safe Havens is a faith-based nonprofit. We're based here in Boston, Massachusetts, and we began work about 25 years ago with just faith community outreach and community education and training, mostly in Greater Boston and New England. But we've been providing technical assistance across the U.S. through the Office on Violence Against Women since 2003. Our mission is really twofold. First of all, we provide resources and training to faith leaders to help them become part of a community-wide response to domestic violence, sexual assault, and elder abuse. And second, we provide resources and training to advocates to help them meet the needs of faith-based clients and build partnerships with local faith leaders. We really believe that faith communities and faith leaders can be a critically important ally in work to end domestic abuse, sexual assault, and elder abuse. But we really hope that that happens in partnership with advocates. So recently an advocate called me who was working with a Christian client. The client was remembering past church teachings about God hates divorce and was struggling to figure out how to be safe. She feared that her faith community would turn against her if she tried to leave her marriage. We knew of a more recent resource that was published by this client's faith community that supports victims and encourages them to seek safety. This resource made all the difference and opened a door to freedom and safety for this victim of abuse. Our goal today is to give you some of the broad context and information and background that can help you better understand and support clients who are Christian. The first thing to know is that there are a lot of Christians in the U.S. On this map, blue represents states that are predominantly Christian, and the darker the blue, the more people identify as Christian. And as you see, this map is very blue. In most states, about 70 to 75% of people are Christian. Only 3 states, and they are all in New England, have less than 60% of their population identifying as Christian. Among older adults, the rates of identification with Christianity are even higher. This means that direct service advocates are likely to encounter many clients who identify as Christian. There are so many forms and traditions within Christianity that it's really hard to capture the breadth of belief and practice. As with the Jewish and Muslim webinars that we've already presented, we recognize that there's tremendous diversity in Christian communities, both across the U.S. and around the world. Even within a particular Christian congregation or a single Christian family, there are diverse views. So we are going to talk about patterns that Christians have in common, but please keep this diversity in mind. So Christians are monotheists. That is, they believe in one God. The vast majority of Christians speak of God in 3 forms, however. This could be Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or Creator, Christ, and Holy Ghost, or another formula that speaks to 3 manifestations of God. But it's important to remember that some Christians reject this Trinitarian formulation as well. Most Christians believe that God creates, loves, guides, judges, and saves them. And most believe that there will be a final day of judgment and that there is life after death. A Christian sanctuary is usually called a church, but it could be called a mission or a chapel or a cathedral. Worship is typically on Sunday morning and often includes education for children and adults. There's often a midweek worship or scripture study as well, usually on Wednesday nights. A Christian clergy person would be a father or a pastor or a deacon or a priest, a bishop, cardinal, elder, presbyter, or metropolitan, but there are other titles as well. The role of Christian clergy also differs by denomination. In some traditions, the clergy is the direct conduit to God, and in others, individual Christians are able to approach God on their own. As in many faiths, holidays provide a rhythm to the year and bring families and congregations together. However, there are some Christians who do not celebrate these holidays at all. So who are the Christians in America? Christianity is first and foremost a global religion, and the 3 main branches are Catholic, or sometimes called Roman Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox. Of the 21.8 billion Christians in the world, and that's about a third of the world's population, 50% are Catholic, 37% are Protestant, and 12% are Orthodox. But the picture in the U.S. is somewhat different than this global picture. Here, the Catholic and Orthodox communities are proportionately smaller than they are globally, while the Protestant community is proportionately larger. In addition, denominations such as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, and Jehovah's Witnesses, which were both founded in the U.S., are proportionately larger. Also, historically Black churches are vibrant and active in the U.S. due to the resilience of African American Christians in the face of the country's long history of racism and oppression. Both the Catholic and the Orthodox Church claim to descend in a direct line from the first Christian communities, and both present a unified set of beliefs and practices. But Protestant Christians are called Protestant because they identify themselves in terms of the defining moment of protest against the Catholic Church when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the door of the church in 1517. Luther was railing against church corruption as well as church overreach, and the resulting movement, which shook the church and the world and brought medieval Europe to an end, became the Protestant Reformation. Protestants have a long history of new denominations bubbling up, sometimes in response to a specific social event or condition, and sometimes in response to a new theological or spiritual awakening. The main branches of the Protestant movement are the evangelical, mainline, and historically Black traditions. 25.4% of the U.S. population are evangelical Protestant, 14.7% are mainline, and 6.5% attend historically Black Protestant churches. So it's much harder to get a bead on what the Protestants as a whole believe because they're not really a unified unit. So, taking a look at the evangelical Protestants, since they're most numerous in the U.S., we're going to start there. Advocates often describe themselves to us as living in the Bible Belt, and we've even heard from advocates who say they are living in the buckle of the Bible Belt. The Bible Belt is a swath of southern and particularly southeastern states where evangelical Protestantism is especially strongly represented. And as you see here, the buckle is these deep, dark blue states where evangelical Protestants are numerous. The Bible Belt states are not only the most Christian, but they are the most evangelical. There are so many evangelical Protestant Christians or evangelicals in the U.S. that many people's sort of stereotypical image of a Christian is an evangelical Protestant Christian. One reason the southern U.S. is called the Bible Belt to begin with is that evangelicals usually understand the Bible as the inerrant Word of God and typically interpret Scripture literally, and thus they became known as the Bible Belt. So generally, and of course remember there's tremendous diversity, but generally, evangelicals emphasize the importance of a personal and salvific relationship with the divine. They're quick to share their faith with others. They typically support traditional family values and gender roles, and they lean socially conservative usually. So what does this mean for advocates and for victims and survivors of abuse? There are many answers to that question. One is that these are states where divorce may be most strongly discouraged and where there may be significant religious, social, and political barriers to safety. So something to keep in mind. The second most numerous group of Christians in the U.S. are called mainline Protestant Christians. These are adherents of denominations such as the Presbyterians or Lutherans, United Methodists, American Baptists, United Church of Christ, or congregational traditions. And you've probably seen these in your communities dotted around. The mainline Protestant Christians are mostly concentrated in South Dakota, West Virginia, North Dakota, Minnesota, Kansas, and Nebraska. And they tend to lean more liberal on a whole host of social issues. Some mainline Christians may be more accepting of divorce or gender equity or of the LGBTQ community, but as always, there is tremendous diversity here. One difference between mainline and evangelical Protestants is the approach to Scripture. As you just heard, evangelicals tend to interpret Scripture rather literally. While a 2008 Pew Research Center study found that 22% of mainline Protestant Christians would agree with their evangelical colleagues on that, another 38% of mainline Protestants thought that the Bible is God's Word, but not to be taken literally, and 28% said the Bible is of human origin. In addition, mainline Protestant Christians generally teach that the Bible should be interpreted through the lens of the culture in which it's written and examined using reason and or experience. In the early 20th century, there was a movement called the social gospel movement among these mainline Protestants, in which they applied Christian ethics and values to all kinds of social problems like poverty, alcoholism, crime, racial tensions, slums, environmental degradation, inadequate schools, and even war. And this has led to an ongoing interest in social justice, prison reform, and work to end racism.
Another branch of the Protestant Church in the U.S. is the historically black Protestant Church. The black church dates back to slavery, when forms of celebration and community were forbidden except in religious and specifically Christian settings. Enslaved black people sang spirituals and created a tradition to uplift themselves in unimaginably horrifying conditions. And the black church soon became a beacon of support and hope for black Americans living under circumstances out of their control, whether that be slavery or Jim Crow segregation or today's mass incarceration and economic marginalization. The black church has also produced and fostered great civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. And helped to nurture liberation theology, which helps black communities envision freedom and maintain hope in unjust circumstances. The historically black church is also spread across many denominations. You might recognize some of these in your own communities. These denominations were for the most part created by faith members or leaders who had experienced discrimination and racism within the white majority church and broke off out of necessity. Many of the denominations date back to slavery, and there are also newer denominations like the Progressive National Baptist Convention. The Progressive National Baptist Convention was formed out of the Civil Rights Movement in support of Martin Luther King Jr. and in protest of the leader of the National Baptist Convention, who was at the time opposed to King and was against the Civil Rights Movement. One of the biblical stories that resonated most with enslaved Black people was that of the Exodus, with its themes of bondage and promise of liberation to those who are suffering. Nat Turner was an enslaved Black man who became a Baptist preacher and believed himself to be very close to God and God's revelations. The Exodus story and his strong faith inspired Nat Turner to lead a rebellion against the slave owners. And although the Turner Rebellion was repressed, numerous other revolts were inspired in part by biblical interpretations and the Exodus story, and these made slave owners and state officials very nervous. So they responded by passing more laws to restrict Black people's freedom of movement, and other laws requiring white oversight of Black congregations. All this couldn't stop Black congregations from growing, and they often organized in secret. So most Black churches were founded by free Blacks. One of the oldest Black Baptist churches was founded by Peter Durrett, who was at the time enslaved, that was in 1790. And anti-slavery work was an important part of Black Christianity. You may have heard of figures like Frederick Douglass, who was a Methodist convert and a former slave. He called on Christians to reject slavery and insisted that it violated the central tenets of Christianity, including the principle of equality before God. Nearly a century after emancipation, the civil rights movement began in opposition to Jim Crow segregation. And again, Black churches were very important in this period. They were places of organizing meetings and preparation for nonviolent disobedience. In the late 1950s, Martin Luther King Jr. and Ella Baker and others founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, you may have heard of it, with the goal of organizing against segregation by uniting churches and congregations into activism. This was very controversial and not accepted by all Black churches. Nevertheless, the civil rights movement was shaped by its Christian elements, its ties to Black churches, and its ability to train leaders in the nonviolent movement. Today, Black churches continue to focus on social justice issues and to give voice to community grievances. So this is a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. Giving a speech 50 years ago in April. He was giving a speech in the New York City church, pictured here, against the Vietnam War. Churches were an important venue for him to spread his message and for the growth of the civil rights movement and the development of new civil rights leaders. During the civil rights movement, politics were given greater priority and addressed directly in the Black church, often leading to debate. So that's a very brief overview of the Protestant Christian movement, and now we'll turn our attention to the Catholic tradition. Worldwide, the Catholic Church is the largest Christian church. In the U.S., Catholicism is widespread and influential. There are particularly strong communities in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Mexico. Catholicism is also predominant in many immigrant and refugee communities. The word Catholic means universal. Like the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church defines itself as the Church Universal and traces its origin to the earliest Christian communities. The Catholic Church is hierarchical, with a network of priests and deacons led by bishops, who are led by archbishops, who are led by cardinals, and they finally look to the Pope for guidance and final authority. Although this hierarchy may at times seem cumbersome, it can be advantageous when it comes to implementing a change in policy. Marriage and families are strongly encouraged by Catholics, and divorce is strongly discouraged. Catholics are also involved in social justice work in support of immigrants and refugees and have organized to end human trafficking. The last denomination of U.S. Christians that we're going to introduce today is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, popularly known as the Mormons. Since fleeing persecution in the 1830s and 40s, the Mormons set up their church in Utah. Today, the church's headquarters are still in Utah, and Mormons are a majority of the state's population. Surrounding states have significant Mormon populations, as you can see here, but most other states have about 1% Mormon populations. And the Mormon tradition is relatively new. In 1830, Joseph Smith founded the movement in New York State. Mormons believe that Joseph Smith is their final prophet and that the Book of Mormon, as well as a collection of Smith's writings, are important religious texts alongside the Bible. Mormons are known for their insularity, political and social conservatism, and their push to proselytize abroad.
The diversity of Protestant Christians make it really difficult to make broad statements about the Protestant churches and domestic violence. Little research has been done, and no one entity speaks for all these disparate denominations. Some, but not all, have a denominational statement on domestic or intimate partner violence, and we have some of those denominational statements on our website if you're interested. However, a survey recently published by Lifeway Research, earlier this year in fact, they surveyed 1,000 Protestant pastors. They were interviewed by phone, and they found that Protestant faith leaders are not adequately responding to domestic violence in their communities. This may be no surprise to some of you. In fact, most Protestant clergy believe their church is already a safe haven for victims, and over half do not know of any victims in their congregation, or they believe that no one in the congregation has experienced domestic violence at all. Now, as we know, domestic violence is prevalent in every faith community, and the statistics don't change much from one place to another, so these churches definitely include victims and survivors. So the responses of these pastors revealed a disconnect that can be harmful to victims and survivors. The same survey found that even though 50% of evangelical pastors, and we're talking evangelical specifically here, even though they agreed that they would believe a victim who comes forward, nearly 70% admitted that they would actually investigate to see if domestic violence was really present. And similarly, nearly 50% of mainline Protestant pastors said they too would need to investigate rather than simply believing the victim. And as you can imagine, that investigation could include all kinds of things that would be unsafe for victims, that would break confidentiality, etc., not to mention the fact that the victim feels disbelieved. So these responses shed light on the frustrating reality that victims are often not believed or supported in the ways that they need to be by their faith leader or faith community. If the faith leader doubts when victims disclose, will that faith leader really take their situation seriously or understand their safety concerns or their need for support? There was another survey by Sojourners and IMA World Health in 2014 that found that the majority of Protestant pastors, and I'm quoting here, underestimate the level of sexual and domestic violence experienced within their congregations, leading to infrequent discussions of the issue from the pulpit, as well as a lack of appropriate support for victims. Unfortunately, a majority of the Protestant pastors who were surveyed have also provided couples counseling in situations of domestic violence. This is something that we teach faith leaders never to do in situations where they suspect that there is abuse of any kind. However, and this is sort of the turning point, the point of hope, 81% of the Protestant pastors who were surveyed in the IMA World Health Survey said that they would like to better support victims if they had the training and resources needed to do so. So we believe that 81% provides hope that the tide has turned and that Protestant faith leaders are becoming increasingly open to learning more about domestic violence.
So we were talking, Anne-Marie was just talking about research in the Protestant community, but there hasn't been any research in other Christian communities. However, some of these Christian communities actually have statements against domestic violence. We also were talking about sometimes how, well, in this case, the Catholic Church being hierarchical, sometimes it's easier to identify an official stand on the church. And the Catholic Church is one of those places that there is a specific statement. In the past, church support for marriage and family has often meant that victims of abuse may have felt they had few options. For example, church law on divorce and annulment has made it difficult for Catholics to seek divorce, and if they are divorced, to remarry. The annulment process can be lengthy and complicated and triggering, particularly for someone who's already in crisis. So this, combined with a lot of strong social pressure, may make ending an abusive relationship challenging. I talked about this, the Catholics now have a statement. They developed it in 2002. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops published a statement on domestic violence entitled, "When I Call for Help." It's available in English, Spanish, and many other languages, and is on our website, and it states unequivocally, I'm quoting, "As pastors of the Catholic Church, we state as clearly and strongly as we can that violence against women inside or outside the home is never justified." The statement discusses what domestic violence is, why victims stay, why abusers abuse, and so forth, and provides resources such as the National Domestic Violence Hotline. The beauty of a hierarchy is that when a decision is made at the top, on-the-ground changes can occur quickly. In the past, a comment that we heard from a Catholic domestic violence victim would have been typical. In 1984, the survivor said, "I told my priest about the abuse 27 years ago. He told me to pray harder. Now I have calluses on my knees and my husband still beats me." Over the last several years, we have heard several more positive narratives from victims who are Catholic, including an older adult who was encouraged by her priest to seek safety. Her advocate related that after the conversation with the priest, the advocate could see the burden lifted from the shoulders of the victim, even in the way she walked and held herself. Again, because they are a cohesive hierarchical unit, the stance of the Mormon Church toward domestic violence is easy to discern and unequivocally supportive of victims. Given the insular nature of the Mormon Church, it is difficult to tell from the outside whether this stated policy is put into practice. However, Safe Havens has spoken to one group of Mormon women who have been blogging about domestic violence and have extensively quoted church teachings that militate against violence in intimate relationships. These are signs of hope. And again, because it's a hierarchy with an identifiable spokesperson, the official Greek Orthodox response to domestic violence is similarly helpful. Although the Greek Orthodox community does not speak for all Orthodox Christians, this is a good sign that the Orthodox community is moving towards support for victims. However, narratives from within the community suggest that, as in many other faith communities, there is still significant silencing, shame, and stigma to overcome before Orthodox Christian victims feel completely supported by their faith communities.
So with this 30,000-foot overview of Christian communities in hand, we wanted to turn now to look at how faith can influence Christian victims and survivors of abuse. But before I do that, I want to stop and ask if there's any questions that you'd like me to answer at this point, or any of us to answer at this point. Alicia, have there been any questions?
I have not seen any questions before this one coming in from Denise right here. How many pastors were surveyed in 2014?
That's a really good question, and I should be able to answer that, but I can't. Off the top of my head, I would have to look back. Denise, I think we have your email, right? Do we have that? Shireen? Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm going to email you the answer, Denise, and I'm sorry I don't know it off the top of my head. And they were all Protestant clergy, and most of them were evangelical Protestant clergy, the 2014 survey. So in that way, it was somewhat limited, but I thought that there may be some overlap with mainline Protestants as well. It seemed like it fit with my just sort of on-the-ground experience.
I think it was 1,000 pastors.
Was it 1,000 in the 2014?
In both.
Okay. Shireen is suggesting that it was 1,000 pastors in both of the surveys. Thank you, Shireen. Okay. Well, barring other questions, and I'll stop again. We'll stop again at the end for questions. But the first thing to remember always is that the teachings of any faith tradition and all faith traditions are both a barrier to safety and a resource. So it's important to keep that sort of double-edged sword in mind. And it's been illustrated repeatedly throughout this multi-religious series of webinars as important in terms of understanding victims of abuse who are faith-affiliated. Over the years, I've heard victims talk about feeling gaslighted, about feeling constantly confused and disoriented, about having the rug pulled out from under them. They're accused of having affairs they haven't had, of doing things they haven't done, of saying things they haven't said, and their words are twisted and used against them. So abuse is crazy-making experience. And in the midst of a life-changing crazy-making crisis, victims need clear, calm, helpful, and coherent, above all, coherent information. But for victims of abuse who are faith-affiliated, one of the things I've noticed, and I think is one of the hardest things for victims to get past, is that the craziness of the abuse itself is sometimes compounded by contradictory information and feedback that they're getting. So it's not a secret that faith communities and the domestic violence movement are sometimes out of step with each other. But what we're perhaps not recognizing is the impact that this incoherence is having on survivors of abuse and how this incoherence can be a huge barrier to safety. So to illustrate, I want to look at 5 issues that victims of abuse who are Christian often wrestle with and give you a sense of what these contradictory messages look like or sound like for those victims. So let's look at forgiveness first. That's one of the big stumbling blocks for Christian victims. Advocates and batterers intervention specialists know that holding an abuser accountable is important for the victim's safety as well as to prevent continued abuse. An emphasis on accountability also creates a culture in which abuse is seen as unacceptable and taken seriously. So for these and other reasons, advocates and others in the DV movement and also in law enforcement encourage accountability. But of course, abusers don't want to be held accountable. They often ask for forgiveness, and they misuse the concept of forgiveness to entrap the victim and to excuse their own violence. And this resonates with many Christian victims who grew up hearing that forgiveness is a Christian requirement and that no matter the injustice committed against them, forgiveness is a necessity. There's tremendous, I think, pressure within congregations to forgive. In fact, many Christians are taught that if they cannot forgive others, their own sins will not be forgiven. It's true that forgiveness can be important for individual healing and well-being, but the stress on forgiveness can undermine accountability and victim safety. So in the midst of the craziness of the abuse itself, victims sometimes receive a mixed message. From advocates, they're hearing about the importance of accountability and how serious domestic violence is. But from their faith leaders, they hear forgive, give the abuser another chance, and this mixed message does not provide victims with the support they need to move forward, and it contributes to the craziness of the abuse. I often think that Christian pastors or priests encourage forgiveness because they themselves are uncomfortable with the situation, really want to patch everything up and make it okay, but that doesn't necessarily help the victim. With training and partnerships with all of you advocates, we're really hopeful that Christian faith communities can provide a way for Christian survivors to forgive if they feel they need to and in their own time, while also prioritizing their own safety and well-being. Forgiveness doesn't have to mean keeping the relationship together, and forgiveness should not have to come at the expense of accountability and certainly not at the expense of safety. So Christian victims may also be hearing mixed messages about safety itself. From an advocate, a Christian victim may hear, "Your safety is our top priority," or "Abuse can be very dangerous." Meanwhile, from the faith community, the victim may hear that divorce is frowned upon or forbidden. Christian victims are often told to keep the marriage together, even if their own safety is at risk. In fact, there was a tragic domestic violence homicide in the Boston area 3 years ago after a Christian victim of 15 years of abuse was persuaded by her faith leader to drop her restraining order, rescind her application for divorce, and go home and make the marriage work no matter what. She was tragically killed by her husband just a few short days later. We believe that the violence and abuse, not the victim's desire for safety, break the covenant of marriage. Faith leaders need training and resources to incorporate this message into their responses to intimate partner violence. We also know that advocates work hard to empower clients. You all provide information and options and encourage clients to make their own decisions, and then you support those decisions. So the message is, you're the expert in your own life, and we believe that you can make good decisions for yourself and for your children. Here again, victims may be hearing mixed messages. Some Christians, not all, but some Christians support male headship or authority in the family. And many Christians support traditional family values and gender norms. If a female client has grown up with these norms of male authority, it might seem uncomfortable for her to assert herself or to challenge her abuser's dominance. Texts about male authority and female submission are sometimes misused to justify or excuse abuse. Many Christian faith leaders are reassessing traditional notions of male headship, and they're pointing out that the head of the family should nurture and strengthen, not undermine, other members of the family. Faith leaders such as Reverend Al Miles and biblical scholars such as Catherine Krager have taken on these issues from within the Christian community. Faith leaders need training and resources to help them reinterpret messages about male headship in a way that supports strong families and the safety of everyone in the family. Advocates also assert that no one deserves to be abused. They're quick to tell their clients that they did not do anything or say anything that made the abuse happen. However, here again, Christian victims may be hearing a mixed message. Many Christians have learned that suffering is part of their faith. They may interpret the suffering of abuse as a test of their spiritual strength, a punishment for past sins, a lesson they should learn from, or a necessary sacrifice that will lead to the abuser changing. When these Christian teachings are internalized by victims and applied to the abusive situation itself, they may feel that they should remain in a situation or that they are somehow meant to be there. At Safe Havens, we believe that no one deserves to be abused. We believe that suffering should not be romanticized and that suffering imposed by another is never justifiable. Training and resources can help Christian faith leaders reevaluate suffering through the lens of the untold suffering of the many Christian victims of abuse who sit in our pews even today. Advocates are also quick to provide resources and support to victims of abuse. They offer help and hope that the future can be brighter and safer than the present. Here again, Christian victims may be hearing a mixed message. While they are hearing "we can help" from advocates, they may also be hearing messages that encourage them to live with and silently endure the violence. These messages include such Christian teachings as "turn the other cheek" and "God won't give you more than you can bear." With additional information about the prevalence and severity of abuse, the impact on long-term health outcomes for the victim, the tragedy of living with long-term PTSD, and the impact on children, many faith leaders are learning to refer victims to community agencies and advocates where they can get help. They assert that Christian teachings should never be used to encourage victims to endure abuse.
While Christian victims often experience their faith as a barrier to safety, there can be no doubt that Christianity has also been a resource for many Christian victims and survivors of abuse. Many victims rely on their faith as a source of strength and courage. They may quote verses such as, with God, all things are possible, and thinking about how hard it will be to get to safety. They may feel that their faith provides them with an unshakable assurance that they'll receive the support they need. Christian clergy have also reinterpreted many of the Christian teachings that have in the past been barriers to safety. It can be helpful for advocates to cultivate relationships with faith leaders who have received training about abuse and who challenge accepted scriptures and traditions that have been misused to undermine safety and justify abuse. It's important for advocates to also consider the legal constraints on their work if their work is supported by government funding. In general, you can't make any one faith normative, and you cannot get in the way of anyone practicing their faith. You can avoid making any one faith normative by making sure that you learn about and welcome many faith communities and traditions and not favor one over another. When you provide a training, invite faith leaders from many different faiths. If you recognize a faith-based holiday, make sure you recognize many faith-based holidays. And if you provide a bibliography of resources, make sure you include a breadth of faith-based resources. We actually have a bibliography that does just that, which we'll be sending out to everyone after this webinar. If you have a faith leader referral list, make sure it includes trusted and trained faith leaders from many faith traditions. As you're able, allow clients to practice their faith. Perhaps you cannot allow open flames in the shelter, but battery-powered candles may work. Accommodations like this can help a faith-based client feel more comfortable and are a simple way to provide culturally competent services. When talking to a client, don't make assumptions about their faith. Don't suggest that everyone should be faith-based, but also don't suggest that everyone shouldn't be faith-based. If clients want to talk about faith, listen, reflect the language they use. Don't jump in with your own beliefs or try to change their beliefs. For many victims who are faithful, their concerns about their faith may be some of the most important considerations as they determine what to do next. We know that you're already welcoming clients of many faiths and cultural backgrounds and clients with no faith affiliation at all. We've learned a few things over the years. First, we've noticed that some people who are not faith affiliated or observant in any way fall back on their family's faith traditions when they're trying to understand abuse or relationships or gender roles in a relationship. There are also folks who are estranged from their faith communities. For example, a victim of abuse may have been re-traumatized by their faith community and is no longer involved. Or a member of the LGBTQ community may feel unwelcome, judged, or censored within their faith community and no longer attend. These folks may still be deeply spiritual, but they're not attending an organized faith community. And there are some clients who have spiritual as well as other needs, and other clients that don't feel a need for spiritual support. Remember, too, that many victims have had faith used against them as a weapon by their abuser or by people who support their abuser. This may be a place of significant trauma and pain. Try to provide support as clients work through these difficult experiences. Ultimately, clients come to you as whole human beings. For some, this will mean that they need space to talk about and heal their spirit as well as their bodies and emotions. Providing a welcoming and supportive space for this journey to begin can be a real benefit to your clients.
So as a summary, I'd like you to think about responding to a faith-affiliated victim as not being so different from providing a safe, culturally sensitive response to any other victim you would be working with. A couple of points to consider. Make referrals only to trusted connections. If you're going to refer a victim to any faith-based organization, a specific faith community or clergy member, please make sure that this is an agency or person that you know will be able to provide a safe response to the victim, one that is victim-centered and that supports the victim's right to safety. If you don't know this for sure, you probably shouldn't make the referral. Also, be sure that your referral list reflects the religious diversity of your community. Another point, don't impose your own beliefs and don't prevent the survivor from speaking of their own beliefs. We all know that that wouldn't be very victim-centered. Lastly, if you do feel comfortable, you can ask about how a victim's faith might be a resource. But if you're not comfortable, you can also be more general and get around the specific question by asking them if they have any groups or beliefs in their life that might be a support to them. And if they are, what might those be? And would the victim like to talk about them? So as you're out in your community, reaching out and developing relationships with faith leaders, remember that you are trying to, you're both, the faith leader and you both have the victim's safety in mind. So you're coming at this with the same concern. And as you're doing your outreach, you're trying to develop a long-standing relationship with this person. So some things to keep in mind would be making sure that you reach out to clergy that you might have a connection with in some way. Go to the low-hanging fruit. If you know the person has an interest or has supported your agency before, follow up with them. Go out and meet with them in person, because in-person relationship, that's how you develop a relationship, face-to-face. You're trying to build a long-lasting, successful relationship. And once you do establish that relationship, ask the faith leader to help you connect with other faith leaders by providing you with an introduction. Always bring resources, whether they're Safe Havens resources or your own agency's resources. Faith leaders really do want to know about the services in their community, so having the opportunity to meet with you and learn about your work will really be a help to them. And call us for help. Safe Havens is here to help you troubleshoot, provide resources, answer your questions, whatever you need. So before we wrap up, I think this is probably a good place to ask if there are any other questions.
Alicia, have any questions been added to the chat box?
I have not seen any questions added. So we can give people a couple more minutes just to type in any questions that they may have.
We received a couple by email, too.
We do have one question that came in before the webinar. How can we ensure that we are being open to all faith backgrounds when we are in a predominantly Christian town?
That's such a good question. I think that, I'll start the answer, and then Shireen and Allison, you can chime in. One of the things that we try to think of when we're working with faith communities and trying to be as multi-religious as we can is, first of all, to think about calendars. So we try to pick dates. If we're doing an event where we want to include all faith leaders, we pick dates that are not anyone's faith-based holiday. And we also avoid Friday, Saturday, and Sunday for trainings, because those are days that many people celebrate their faith or are observing their faith. So we're typically Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but we make sure that we are not in the middle of any faith holidays. So, for example, we don't, even in a predominantly Christian community, we would not provide a training on Yom Kippur, or we would not invite everyone to a lunch meeting during Ramadan. And so we try to stay cognizant of the whole breadth of faith holidays. And then also the other category that we think about or think in is language. And many of you who have heard us do a training know that we start out by saying, if you are talking, and we're saying this to participants who are both faith leaders and advocates, if you're talking about your own faith tradition, please use the language that works for your faith community. So if it's a Bible, call it a Bible. If it's a rabbi, call him a rabbi or her a rabbi. If it's a mosque, call it a mosque. Use your own specific language, because we don't think that being multi-religious means we all need to be oatmeal mush in the middle of the room at all. So hang on to your specific traditions and language. However, we talk also about building up an interfaith movement or a multi-religious movement against abuse. And when we are talking about faith communities in that wider movement and we want to include everyone, we use language that includes everyone. So instead of calling the faith leader a pastor, for example, we would call the person a faith leader. And instead of saying mosque, we would say thanks community or sanctuary or sacred space. And instead of saying Torah, we would say Holy Scriptures or something like that. So we try to use language that includes all of us when we are talking about all of us. And so I think when you're reaching out to your faith community leaders and you really want to include a broad swath of faith leaders, it's helpful to use that kind of inclusive language so that everyone knows that they are invited to the table and to the conversation. So what else am I forgetting about being multi-religious? Anything else? Other ideas? No? Okay.
I know we only have a few more minutes. Can I read another one of the questions?
Yeah, please. There's another question.
How can I help clients who have received negative feedback from clergy who do not believe them or support them in getting away from an abusive relationship?
Another difficult question. And I wish I had all the answers. We have been trying to be as preventive as we can. We try to provide training to faith leaders so that we don't get ourselves in a situation where this is happening. However, I know that not every faith leader is trained, and not even close to every faith leader is trained, and I also know how stretched thin we all are, and it will be quite some time before we have reached every faith leader with training. So we typically try to allow survivors to talk about what they've experienced, and we try to be as supportive as we possibly can in the middle of that. We acknowledge that what they have experienced has been re-traumatizing and how difficult it is to hear those sorts of things from a faith leader especially. So we're very, very supportive of survivors who are in that position. If we can, we try to encourage the survivor to maybe pick up a resource that is written specifically for their community, their faith community, that may be more supportive. And the bibliography that Shireen mentioned earlier will include some of those resources. So that may be helpful. Now remember, when you have resources in a bibliography, though, you want to make sure that you have resources that are responsive to as many faith communities as possible. So make sure your bibliography is multi-religious. But there are various resources that are written specifically for victims and specifically for victims from particular faith communities. So for example, the When I Call for Help pamphlet for Catholic women can sometimes be helpful for someone who has gotten a not very friendly response from their priest. There are also resources. There's a fabulous resource from Faith Trust Institute called Keeping the Faith, and it's a little booklet written specifically for usually Protestant Christians, victims, and it looks at some of the scriptures that have been roadblocks and helps to reinterpret them. And there are also similar resources for the Jewish community. I'm trying to think of the name of it.
I think it's called You Are Not Alone by Toby Landisman.
Yeah, that's also on the bibliography. And then for Muslim victims, there's a great little booklet by Salma Abujaderi, who was our presenter at the last webinar about, I think it's called something like what Islam says about domestic violence, and that too is helpful. So sometimes you can find resources for folks from outside of their immediate congregation. That doesn't, however, help if someone is very community-oriented and really would like a community around them. And I've seen various things happen. I've seen some survivors end up changing faith communities. I know that that can be really, really difficult and is not at all what we would hope in the long run would happen. We've also seen survivors receive spiritual support in other ways as well. So it's kind of a cobbling together resources, trying to be as supportive as you can, and reaching as many faith leaders as you can in your community with training and resources to try to turn the tide on the response that victims are getting. That said, I will admit to you freely that there are some faith leaders that we've had a hard time reaching, and there are times when we have decided to abandon the effort for a while and maybe go back to it later. But we know that your time is very limited and your energy and resources are limited. So and when Allison said go after the low-hanging fruit, sometimes that's the best place to start. And Shireen says there's another question. Oh, I thought you said there was another question. No?
Someone's asking, can we get links to the resources you're mentioning online?
Yes. So the bibliography that we're mentioning, we're just waiting for final approval from OVW, and then we'll be sending that out to everyone who registered for this webinar, but we'll also put it up on our website. Also on our website, you can find resources. We have, for example, a domestic violence booklet. We have a sexual violence booklet. We have an elder abuse booklet and pamphlet. We have partnership guides, and to help all of you with outreach, we put together outreach guides for both elder abuse and domestic and sexual violence in rural communities. I know that not all of you are in rural communities, and we are working actively now to adapt our resources to be more general. So you'll see those up on the website soon. But in the meantime, the rural resources can give you a good idea for where to start and can give you something to have in your hand when you go to visit a faith leader or make an appointment. We also have checklists for y'all about things to consider before you make a meeting, before you set up with a meeting with a faith leader, and things to consider for that first visit, just to make sure that you are considering all the different ways that you want to think through the situation before you walk into it. So we have a couple of checklists that will be helpful as well.
Okay, we only have a couple minutes left, but we do have a question, or someone said, be careful of all Christian resources that look good. I've found some of them to write about LGBTQ people in a negative way. I don't know if you want to comment on that. And then another question that says, any ideas for resources when it is a clergy person who is either the abuser or the abused?
Okay, so both of those quickly. We are really, really careful, and I would caution all of you to be very careful. Some faith-based resources are negative toward the LGBT community, or sometimes they, in subtle ways, blame victims or encourage victims to forgive or to return to relationships that are abusive. So we are really, really, really careful with resources, and we hope that you will be too. We can help you with some of that. If you want to send us anything, we'll look at it for you. And we're available for training, technical assistance. Email us, call us, whatever you want to do, we're available.
I want to just add in, there are also some agencies that say that they work with victims of domestic and sexual violence, that they're faith-based and they offer a faith-based response. You would just be leery because a lot of times, just like Anne-Marie said, sometimes the literature is blaming victims, sometimes the agencies are blaming victims, and the focus isn't on the victim and there's the victim's safety. So just keep that in mind.
And they can also be vehicles for proselytizing, and proselytizing is when you try to, not force, but you try to recruit
actively.
Yeah, actively recruit people to your faith community, which we would argue is not at all appropriate if someone is undergoing domestic violence. It's not a good time. It's an inappropriate time, and it can be very, very unsafe for victims and survivors to encounter that kind of proselytizing. As many of you know, victims are often looking for things to change about themselves to make the abuse better. So we don't want them to think, oh, if I just change my faith, it will get better. So with that, I'm afraid all the rest of the questions you'll have to call us or email us, and we'll move on and finish this off. Shereen?
Okay. Very quickly, we have 4 more webinars in this year's series coming up in May and June. The next one is on May 11th. They're all at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you have, here's the full list of this year's series. If you have missed any, you can find them on our website. So the next one will be May 11th on African American victims and survivors. And then there will be one on clergy abuse. I know that was one of the questions that came up.
Yes, actually, one of the best resources for clergy abuse is Faith Trust Institute again, and I encourage you to look at their website on that, and they will be presenting in this webinar series about working with victims of clergy abuse and what that looks like.
So if you have any questions about the webinar series or finding the right resources for your clients or your community members, or if you would like to invite Safe Havens to provide training in your community for advocates and or faith leaders, you can contact us at info@interfaithpartners.org as written on the screen, or call us at 617-951-3980. You can also find resources on our website at interfaithpartners.org under the Resources tab. This webinar series, all of the webinars will be under the Our Resources tab on a tab Supporting Victims and Survivors webinars. So just a word about our trainings. We include funding for 3 community trainings in our OVWTA grant. So we could provide training for faith leaders in your community at no cost to you. We have limited training slots, so if you'd like to come, give us a call for details, and we'd be happy to discuss whether this opportunity would suit you in your community. We're deeply grateful that you joined us for this webinar, and we hope to welcome you back next time. Thank you so much.
Hope to see you all again.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. You'll now be directed to a brief survey about today's event.